is my shepherd, I have all I need. He lets me rest and leads me beside the streams. He renews my strength. He guides me along the path that I ride, restoring my soul, all for His name's sake. So let it be. And even when I walk through the darkest valley, I will not be afraid, 'cause I know that you walk right there beside me, and I am not afraid. Oh, I need you, Jesus. Yes, I need you. And if I have you, Jesus, no, I don't need a thing. Your rod and your staff protect me. You make a feast in front of my enemies. You fill my cup. Surely your goodness and unfailing love will chase after me all of the days of my life. Yes, every day. Even when I walk through the darkest valley, I will not be afraid. And I know that you walk
All right. Welcome back. I appreciate you being here. Those who haven't been able to be here each day, help spread the word that on our YouTube channel they'll be able to see the live stream preserved there for any sessions that they missed. Yesterday, I was reminded by more than one person that I didn't finish the outline. Have you ever met me? What we didn't talk about yesterday was in Joshua chapters 14 and 15. I'm going to leave that to you to go back and discover, but the two sections that I was going to talk about, let me just mention the stories that we sort of blazed past. In Joshua chapter 14, we have an absolutely incredible story about a man named Caleb. You recognize Caleb was one of the two spies alongside Joshua who years before in the book of Numbers had come back with a report from spying out the land saying, it doesn't matter that there are giants there, the Lord is on our side, we can do this. And like Joshua, Caleb was allowed to survive that generation that died in the wilderness. And in Joshua chapter 14, we have a fella who at this point is probably at least 85 years of age. And in chapter 14, we have him stepping forward and saying, give me my mountain. It's fascinating to me because Joshua and Caleb, they didn't belong in the wilderness for 40 years. But they were a part of Israel. They were a part of the corporate identity of the nation. And so, as patiently as they could abide it, they marched in circles, kicking up dust with the rest of the nation. But I tell you this, God has a brilliant plan all the time. And I'm sure that one of the things that happened on a regular basis in that 40 years in the desert was the young people who were being raised up, who were young enough to be allowed to live, and they knew that the conquest of the land would eventually fall to their generation. I think they probably told jokes about Caleb and Joshua, because, they were the oldest people in any direction. And yet I'm convinced that part of the way God prepared Israel for the time that we've been looking at in the book of Joshua must have been all of those nights around a campfire in some sort of corporate gathering where the young men, the ones sort of yearning to be the hero, they must have said, hey, Caleb, tell us again about the land. Who knows how many times Caleb recounted his report. A land flowing with milk and honey. That's simply a colloquial way of saying it is abundant in its resources. It is a land filled with everything that you could imagine. We've been marching around in the desert for a generation, but just on the other side of that river is everything you've ever dreamed about. And oh, by the way, there's a mountain over there. It's mine. And God promised it to me. And I don't care if I'm 85 or 105, I'm getting my mountain. Caleb is one of my favorite characters in the Old Testament because he is the epitome of a man who says, I'm not finished until God lays me down and lets me die. I don't know where this uniquely Western idea of retirement comes from, but we have this idea that at some point in life, it's okay to just pull up a chair and just sit back because you're through. You're through when you stop breathing in and out. And until that point, God has something for you to be about. Chapter 14, Caleb steps up and he says, okay, we're in the land. The conquest is underway. Give me my mountain. I love that. Chapter 15, the influence of Caleb continues because we know from the book of Judges that after Joshua dies, the first judge that is selected to lead Israel is a man named Othniel. Othniel, because of his own heroism, helping Caleb get his mountain, Othniel is granted the gift of Caleb's daughter as a wife. So Othniel becomes Caleb's son-in-law. And when he's selected to be a judge in the first couple of chapters of the book, in chapter 2 of the book of Judges, what we see is he was the classic choice. He was a man, if you can put it this way, a man after Caleb's own heart. He had the same attitude. He had the same faithfulness. He had the same determination. And so what you see in chapter 15 is Othniel, married to Caleb's daughter. They've secured the land, but Caleb, after all these years of setting his sights on his claim, he doesn't hold it close. He doesn't grab it and keep it. He starts parceling it out. He gives it to his son-in-law and his daughter. He makes it available. In fact, we're going to see a passage today where part of Caleb's inheritance, if you will, he gives away when they're assigning cities to the Levites, the priestly tribe. There's some real important lessons from Caleb's life. One is don't quit too soon. One is don't hold anything in your hands. Don't hold anything in your heart that you can hold in your hands. Even though he had waited a generation to get his mountain, he was still a big-hearted giver. And third, he gave particularly to sustain the Levites, the priests, who would be the spiritual leaders of Israel. Caleb knew as much as Israel needed a military, as much as Israel needed a strong economy, what Israel had to always have, what would be the downfall of Israel, as it has been the downfall of every other nation, is when spiritual leadership fails to draw a nation continually back to God. They cannot survive. So Caleb is a great example for us, and the influence that he exerted on Othniel is a part of his story of influence and impact. So there's chapters 14 and 15. Go read those passages and let the Holy Spirit guide you as you ponder them and as you stop and think. We're going to finish the book of Joshua today. We should be done by about 4:15. But we're going to jump to chapter 18. These chapters we saw chapters that we skipped over that really has to do with the southern conquest and then the northern conquest, and then there was a section of the conquest of the Anakim, the giants that were primarily in the mountains. And so we've looked past the actual progression of the battles. And then we've sort of skipped all of these chapters that speak about the distribution of the land. Each tribe got this and got that. But I want to step into that process, the accounting of the distribution of the land. And I want to look at chapter 18, because there is sort of a halftime, a midway point. What we find out is that in the course of the conquest, most of the nations have been defeated at this point. Some have been annihilated. Others, remnants, were allowed to live. Israel really, in some ways, had a partial obedience that would eventually get them into real trouble. Frankly, that's what the next book, the book of Judges, that's the story. Israel's partial obedience of not fully evicting or exterminating these cancerous nations produced a cycle of downward decline of spiritual depravity that will plague Israel for about 300 years. But here we're at the midway point, in a sense, of the distribution of the land. And in chapter 18, verse 1, it says, "Then the whole congregation of the sons of Israel assembled at Shiloh and set up the tent of meeting there, and the land was subdued before them. But there remained among the sons of Israel 7 tribes who had not divided their inheritance." Now this is interesting because I would call this the danger of suffering victory. They have been very successful to this point, a couple of blips along the way, but basically the conquest has proceeded as they expected. And yet what we have in chapter 18 is that a nation, frankly, weary of war at this point. The temple, the tabernacle, the tent of meeting as it's called, had been established at Gilead. You remember when they crossed over, Gilead was the place where they paused for several days so that they could circumcise all the men of the nation. Gilead was the place that symbolized their complete separation from the peoples of Canaan. And while the tabernacle, the tent of meeting, while it was at Gilead, they always had to return there. That was the headquarters. It was sort of on an extreme end because it was at the entrance, basically, into the promised land. They kept returning there, but the very presence of the tabernacle in Gilead was a constant reminder in the front of their brain that this is where we separated ourselves. This is where we affirmed that we're different. We're not like the people around us. We're chosen by the people of God. We have special privileges, but we have special responsibilities. We're not like everybody else. At some point, they've made excursions into the land far enough that they moved the tabernacle to Shiloh. Now, you can make the case that that's just logistically a better place. It's not out on the extreme edge of the land. It's now more centrally located. It's more convenient as a launching place. You could make that argument, except verse 2 seems to imply that they weren't launching. They moved the tabernacle to Shiloh, and it implies that they sort of just closed down shop for a minute. They were tired. They'd been in battle, and yet there's a very telling statement in verse 2. 7 tribes still didn't have their land. Now, the story of the conquest is a story of the certainty of the promises of God. But the certainty of God's promises are always coupled with the determination of God's people to pursue the reality of those promises. There's not any place in the Bible that we're taught this idea that is so prevalent in our day, this sort of let go and let God attitude. Let go and let God. Why don't we all just snuggle up with a pillow and a blanket, and we'll just wait for the Heaven Express to just float us up to the pearly gates on a satin pillow? That's the way, frankly, some people live the Christian life. They view themselves in the terminal waiting room, just waiting to catch the flight that takes them home. I don't know if you've ever spent much time. I have. In a airport terminal, waiting for a flight. Good Lord, that's a miserable existence. And yet that's exactly how many Christians try and live their Christian life. I got my ticket in my pocket, my bags are checked, I'm just waiting. No, that's not it. God has given us promises, but we are here because He's called us to participate in the unfolding of those promises. There were many places remaining in the promised land that were still unsubdued. There were some nations that were still unconquered. Let me just turn back a couple of pages. Look at chapter 15, verse 63. Now, as for the Jebusites, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the sons of Judah could not drive them out, so the Jebusites live with the sons of Judah in Jerusalem to this day. Chapter 16, verse 10. But they did not drive out the Canaanites who lived in Gezer, so the Canaanites live in the midst of Ephraim to this day, and they became forced laborers. Chapter 17, verse 12. It says, but the sons of Manasseh could not take possession of these cities because the Canaanites persisted in living in this land. And it came about, when the sons of Israel became strong, they put the Canaanites to forced labor, but they did not drive them out completely. Okay, it'd be easy for Israel to go, well, we didn't exterminate them, but we did turn them into bondservants. We made them into slaves, except that's not what God's instruction was. When we jump over to the early chapters of Judges sort of recounts the time of Joshua. And there's a fascinating lesson there, because it says that this tribe took this piece of land, but these Canaanites were allowed to live there. And this tribe took this piece of land, but these Canaanites were allowed to live there. And this tribe took this land, but these Canaanites were still allowed to live there. But then it says something very interesting about the tribe of Asher. It says, and Asher took this piece of land, but Asher lived in the bosom of the Canaanites. In other words, at least for the tribe of Asher, it wasn't just that there were some rogue Canaanites allowed to still run around. Asher's territory was so incompletely subdued that they were actually the minority living among the Canaanites. That is not how this was supposed to go. That is not the plan that they had been given. After some successes, so many successes, now we're beginning to see the failures pile up. Why? I don't know. Was God withholding power in some of these later battles because Israel had begun to take credit for their victories? Was He allowing them to have incomplete victory because they were less than enthusiastic about carrying out the call to obedience? See, here's the thing. They moved everything to Shiloh so it'd be more convenient. They wanted a time of rest. But in this battle, in this spiritual warfare, God grants no furloughs. And it is not up to His people to choose to take one. In our generation, when the church sits down and says, we're just going to rest for a bit, God moves on, because He is moving with the movers. He's shaking with the shakers. And a church that's willing to just go along to get along is a church that never will see any victory. Israel may have begun to take credit for their victories. They had certainly become satisfied with the land they had already won. I think they were becoming tired of the inconvenience of constant advance. Verse 2 gives us that hint. But there were 7 tribes who had not divided up their inheritance yet. They're not even halfway. And so here's what Joshua does. He says, I've got to secure the vision. I've got to recapture for these people a holy dissatisfaction with where they are right now. One of the things that I've tried to do over these 25 years at certain milestone moments, anniversary dates, and special times, I've tried to lay out a vision. Part of the vision is what it's always been, and part of it is new for a new day. Why do you do that? Because vision wanes. It ebbs. You lose it. over time. It has to be renewed. It has to be recaptured. And so that's what Joshua sets out to do here. Look at verse 3. So Joshua said to the sons of Israel, how long will you put off entering to take possession of the land which the Lord, the God of your fathers, has given you? Well, that's a challenge right up in their face. How long are you going to take to do what God has already promised you to do? Are you really satisfied to live here when you have territory for 7 tribes just out there waiting to be seized by the power of God? How long? Verse 4, provide for yourselves 3 men from each tribe, so that I may send them, and that they may arise and walk through the land and write a description of it according to their inheritance. Then they shall return to me. And they shall divide it into 7 portions. Judah shall stay in its territory on the south, and the house of Joseph shall stay in their territory on the north. And you shall write a description of the land in 7 divisions, and bring the description here to me. Then I will cast lots for you here before the Lord our God. For the Levites have no portion among you, because the priesthood of the Lord is their inheritance. Gad, Reuben, and the half-tribe of Manasseh also have received their inheritance eastward beyond the Jordan, which Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave them. Then the men arose and went, and Joshua commanded those who went to write a description of the land, saying, go and walk through the land, and write a description of it, and return to me. Then I will cast lots for you here before the Lord in Shiloh. So the men went and passed through the land, and wrote a description of it by cities in 7 divisions in a book. And they came to Joshua at the camp at Shiloh. Joshua then cast lots for them in Shiloh before the Lord, and there Joshua divided the land for the sons of Israel according to their divisions. Here's what happens. In the same way that I think God probably used Caleb in the wilderness to keep the promise, to keep the vision of the land of milk and honey right in the front of their brains. Caleb, tell us more about the land. Well, let me tell you what I saw. I saw fruit so big it took 2 men to carry it. I saw deer. I saw food just walking past. We've lived in the desert. We've lived on manna. We've lived on quail. Wouldn't you like to have a crop that you sow in the land and it grows so abundantly that we are baking bread, we are making pies. We're gonna get fat off the abundance of the land. Caleb was the perpetuator of the vision. Joshua now looks at a people who are tired. And he says, okay, here's what we're going to do. I want you to pick some representatives, and we're going to send them out. And they're going to write a description of what they see. What's he doing? He's bringing back witnesses to tell the same stories that Caleb has been telling for a generation. He's going to renew their commitment to something better than what they already have by putting it right in front of them to see, for it to capture their imagination. He says, then we're going to divide it up, and we're going to cast lots, and we're going to assign the inheritance to the different tribes. You see, it's one thing, I think, to just sort of fight for, just what's out there. It's another thing to have a section of description written in a book for a particular land, and then having Joshua say, Manasseh, Reuben, this description, this is mine. All of a sudden, it's not just Caleb, it's the leadership of 7 different tribes going, give me my mountain, give me my portion. Joshua is a masterful leader at this point because he's renewing their ability to grasp a vision, to have their imagination captured. The divine task that had been assigned to Joshua was help the people regain the vision of the future God has for them. Send them out. Have them make a map of the land. Help them make an accurate description, a detailed outline of the natural landmarks of the natural boundaries, of the things that they will then someday call their own. Even the secular world acknowledges great finishers. I mean, we use that language when we describe racehorses or boxers or baseball teams that have a great closer. Even in the opera, we say it ain't over till the fat lady sings. We know that the greatest accomplishments always have a strong finish. That's what Israel needed here. They needed a strong finish. The Bible teaches us that all the way through the New Testament. We have the Apostle Paul in 2 Timothy chapter 4. He says, I've fought the good fight. I've run the race. I've kept the faith. And now there's a crown that's waiting for me. We know that John, with his visions that he records for us in the book of Revelation, in chapter 21, he says, I saw it. I saw home. I saw Jesus wiping the last remnant of the last tear of the last believer who suffered the last little bit of persecution. It's gone. I saw it. You know, John was in his 90s. He's not that far away from the pearly gates. But I'm telling you, you never, at any age, capture a vision of what God has in store for us that you don't say, man, I can't wait to get home. There's Jesus on the cross. What's the most famous thing he said from the cross? It is finished. Israel, at this moment in chapter 18, they're stuck. They're spinning their wheels in the mud. And Joshua, as a great leader, brings them back to the place where they are determined to finish what they started. There's too much that God has for us. There's too much that He has promised us for us to just settle down and be satisfied with something other than what He has in store for us. Well, they begin the conquest of these last sections, and in the next couple of chapters outline the territory of these remaining tribes. Turn over to chapter 21. We see this chapter 18, this renewed vision played out now, and for several chapters they are winning battles, and they are laying claim to territory, and they are assigning inheritance to the different tribes. Then we come to chapter 21, and we have one other consideration. Now let me explain real quickly about the 12 tribes of Israel. There were 12 sons of Jacob, who eventually was renamed Israel. Those 12 sons become what we refer to as the patriarchs. The family, because of famine, moves to Egypt, and that family of 12 sons with their family members, a family totaling 70 people, they move to Egypt. They're under the protection of Joseph. You remember the Joseph story? He's carried off into Egypt. God blesses him. He becomes an incredibly powerful and influential man. So under his care, they move to Egypt, where they're provided for during famine. Joseph dies, but there is a regime change between the end of Genesis and the start of Exodus. And it says in Exodus that there was a Pharaoh who didn't know Joseph. In other words, there was a new line of Pharaohs that didn't have the institutional memory of the Pharaohs that had been in charge, that esteemed Joseph because of his contribution to save the nation. That's when we begin this process of Israel moving from welcome guests to slaves, 400 years. Now, these 12 sons become the patriarchs of 12 tribes, which make up the nation of Israel. Now, here's what happens. Joseph, as the favored son, Joseph is granted 2 portions of the land, of the inheritance. Though that's why Joseph is never mentioned really as a tribe, because Joseph's 2 sons were Ephraim and Manasseh. So you've got 11 brothers, and now you have the 2 sons of Joseph. That's 13. See, I can do that math in my head. Okay, but going all the way back to the original structure that God planned in the books of Moses, the tribe of Levi, they were never to have their own inheritance of the land. The Levites were to be the priests. They were to be the spiritual presence that sort of was dispersed throughout all of the 12 tribes. So the plan was always from the beginning that there would be 12 divisions, basically 10 brothers, and then the 2 sons of Joseph. That's the 12 tribes of Israel. But there is, in a sense, an additional tribe, the Levites, and they are to live among the nations because they fulfill this priestly role, okay? So that's the backstory. We get to chapter 21, and it says, "Then the heads of fathers' households of the Levites approached Eleazar the priest, Joshua the son of Nun, and the heads of fathers' households of the tribes of the sons of Israel." In other words, all of the leadership. "And they spoke to them at Shiloh in the land of Canaan, saying, 'The Lord commanded through Moses to give us cities to live in with their pasture lands for our cattle.' The Levites had been appointed to have the responsibility of the priesthood for the entire nation of Israel. They had been instructed that they were not going to receive a land inheritance, but their divine provision was that they were going to be supported by the tithes of all of the people in the other tribes. Part of this was designed to help them avoid what we might call worldly entanglements. In other words, part of the reason that it's appropriate to pay your pastors is because it allows the pastors to not have to have some of the worldly considerations that come with going out and finding another job and doing all of those kinds of things. The Levites were not to be farmers. They were not to be merchants. They were not to be businessmen. They were not to be They were not to be occupied with those kinds of things. God said, "I'm going to spread you out among the people. You're going to be spiritual leaders responsible for teaching the people to obey the law, to teach them the Word of God, and you will be supported by the tithe that I expect from the tribes." That's where the tithe in the Old Testament goes. It is for the support of the tabernacle, eventually for the support of the temple, but by extension, that is the living support that is provided for all of the priests across the nation. Because we've disconnected the idea of tithing from the reality of the way God designed His people to operate, I hear people talk about tithing like, they'll say things like, "Well, that church has plenty of money. They're paying the utility bills fine without my money." Yeah, your giving has never been about paying utility bills. It has been about you showing loyalty and faithfulness to the provision that God has put into your hands by using what He's given you to provide the sustenance and the support for other people that God has charged to give you spiritual support and guidance. If we could reattach giving to what God really intended it, I think we'd have a better attitude by and large. Now, I'm speaking about the church in this generation in general. This church, by and large, is an extraordinary giving church. Do not hear me complaining. I'm speaking about the American church in general. Now, here we have the Levites. They have waited until all the land has been divided. They've trusted God. They've claimed His promises. And here they are saying, okay, all the land has been distributed. Now we want the cities that have been promised to us. We haven't received those cities, but frankly, they wouldn't receive them until they laid claim to them. They pleaded the provisions of God by referencing his promises and saying, we want what was promised. What the Levites are doing in chapter 21 is essentially the same thing Caleb was doing in chapter 14 when he says, give me my mountain. The Levites said, we're content at what God has instructed us to do. We will be the priests. We will serve in this way. We will be supported at the generosity of the other tribes because we trust God. But Joshua, it's time for that to happen. Yes, it is. And so in verse 3, it says, so the sons of Israel gave the Levites from their inheritance these cities with their pasture lands in accordance with the command of the Lord. Now, the rest of this chapter is basically an inventory of entire cities. Now remember, these cities and villages are essentially already built. I mean, there were a few that were burned down in the process of the conquest, but essentially as the tribal peoples were exterminated or evicted, the Israelites just inherited entire cities. And so they gave cities a certain number from each tribe based on the population of that tribe. That determined the number of cities within their tribal allotment of land. They gave them to the Levites. This is where they would live. This would be their base of operations as they then traveled to serve as priests throughout all of the land of Israel. Look in verse 11. It says, so they gave them Kiriath Arba. Arba being the father of Anak, that is Hebron, in the hill country of Judah, with its surrounding pasture lands. But the fields of the city and its villages they gave to Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, as his possession. So to the sons of Aaron, the priest, they gave Hebron, the city of refuge for the one who commits manslaughter, with its pasture lands, Libnah with its pasture lands. Okay, I only read those verses because it mentions Caleb. This area of Kiriath Arba, that was the main city where the giants lived, the Anakim. What's significant is when of all the land of Canaan, of everything Caleb could have laid claim to, for 40 years, when Caleb was dreaming about his mountain, this is it. He didn't take some flat land somewhere. He didn't take a hill where there was some minimal opposition. He said, I want that mountain. Well, Caleb, that's precisely where the giants live. I don't care. That's my mountain. He gets his mountain. Kiriath Arba is basically renamed Hebron. And what's he immediately do? He's already given some of his possession to his daughter and his son-in-law Othniel, but here he just passes out other cities, gives them to the Levites. Why? Because he's the hero of this story. He's going to participate in the promises of God. He understood that giving is a sacred debt. There's no spirit of miserliness or stinginess that's really acceptable for the people of God. Not just Caleb, but every tribe was given opportunity to participate. They weren't required to have uniform assessments. They weren't taxed to provide these gifts to the Levites, but they gave according to the extent of their own possessions. In other words, their gifts reflected the possessions that they had inherited. Folks, this is a great Old Testament principle that comes into the New Testament. People say, well, tithing, Pastor, tithing is not New Testament. Okay. I think I can make a case that tithing is New Testament. But here, let's just concede the point. Tithing is not New Testament. But you know what is New Testament? The same principle that we see all the way through the Old Testament, which is giving requires two things. Giving requires a heart that is moved by the Spirit to participate. And giving requires an understanding of how much I've received, and my giving should reflect my gratitude for what has been given to me. You see, tithing, it's not biblical. It's not New Testament. Well, here's the thing. 10%, frankly, that's just a great place to start. That just gives some people need a target. They need to know what they need to do. Start there. But you know what? 10% for some people, that is a real commitment. Good. It needs to be a real commitment. But 10% for other people, don't even notice it. You should give to the kingdom of God at such a level, whatever that level is, you should give at such a level that you feel that gift. The tribes responded. They provided for the Levites. Caleb gives us a personal example, but all of the tribes were involved. And so we have here the blessing that comes to them because they are now, as we come to the close of the conquest period, they are fully addressing who they were meant to be. Now, when we get to chapter 23, chapter 23 is the start of Joshua's farewell address. His days are coming to a close. His time of leadership is about finished. He was raised up to be the successor to Moses, but he was never going to live forever. He was there for an assignment. And when his assignment is completed, his time is passing. It starts in chapter 23, but I want you to go with me to chapter 24 because we're going to see how this story really finishes. In chapter 24, it says, Then Joshua gathered all the tribes of Israel at Shechem and called for the elders of Israel, their heads, their judges, and their officers, and they presented themselves before God. Joshua said to all the people. Now, before we get to his actual speech, notice he draws the entire nation together as a family. Israel was assembled with a clear sense of purpose and with the presence of God. God is going to speak to people who know him. That's why we refer to ourselves as family, the family of God. We are not an institution. We are not an organization. We are bound by something deeper than that. What we share is not just a membership card. We share adoption papers. So when he calls the people together, he is like a father to the nation. He is the father that Moses had been, and he calls the family together as a nation. And he says in a very straightforward way in verse 2, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. This was about to be a direct word from God through Joshua for Israel. Now remember, I just said a few minutes ago that it's appropriate for a leader to renew the vision, to set out the same decisions that have been made before, but those decisions that need to be renewed, they need to be made again by a new generation. Throughout the Old Testament, we have that original covenant that God made with Abraham and the covenant that God made with Moses and the people. That covenant is laid out again and again in new generations because new generations have to say, okay, my grandfather believed this, my great-grandfather believed this, my great-great-grandfather believed this, but what matters is, do I believe this? Will I say yes to this? God represented the covenant, and he called Israel to renew it. And so Joshua understands there was a significant break in the story at the end of the life of Joseph. There's a significant break in the story at the end of the life of Moses. And Joshua fully understands, as the father of the nation, that there is a significant break in the story as his life is now coming to a close. And so he does what has been done at each significant moment along the way. He lays out the instruction. He renews the invitation to participate in covenant with God. because he needs this new generation going forward to say yes. Look at this, from verse 2 on. He's going to give us, he's going to start by reviewing the story. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. From ancient times, your fathers lived beyond the Euphrates River, namely Terah, the father of Abraham and the father of Nahor, and they served other gods. Then I took your father Abraham from beyond the Euphrates River and led him through all the land of Canaan and multiplied his descendants and gave him Isaac. To Isaac I gave Jacob and Esau, and to Esau I gave Mount Seir to possess it, but Jacob and his sons went down to Egypt. Then I sent Moses and Aaron, and I plagued Egypt by what I did in its midst, and afterward I brought you out. So I brought your fathers out of Egypt, and you came to the sea, and Egypt pursued your fathers with chariots and horsemen to the Red Sea. But when they cried out to the Lord, he put darkness between you and the Egyptians, and brought the sea upon them, and covered them, and your own eyes saw what I did in Egypt. And you lived in the wilderness for a long time. Then I brought you into the land of the Amorites, who lived beyond the Jordan, and they fought with you, but I handed them over to you, and you took possession of their land when I eliminated them before you. Then Balak, the son of Zippor, king of Moab, rose up and fought against Israel, and he sent messengers and summoned Balaam, the son of Beor, to curse you. But I was not willing to listen to Balaam, so he had to bless you, and I saved you from his hand. You crossed the Jordan and came to Jericho, and the citizens of Jericho fought against you, and the Amorite, the Perizzite, the Canaanite, the Hittite, the Girgashite, the Hivite, and the Jebusite. Therefore I handed them over to you. Then I sent the hornet before you, and it drove out the 2 kings of the Amorites from you, not by your sword nor your bow. And I gave you a land on which you had not labored, and cities which you had not built, and you have lived in them. You are eating of vineyards and olive groves which you did not plant. He's just covered the entire story. Abraham starts in chapter 12 of Genesis, and Joshua brings us right up to date. The call of Abraham, the gift of Isaac, the blessings given to Jacob, the plagues on Egypt, the Exodus, the Red Sea parting, the conquest of the Amorites and the Moabites, the destruction of Jericho and all of the other nations, the free gifts of cities, land, vineyards, and orchards. All of history for Israel is now on display, and it points to a single source, God's grace. All credit goes to Him. It's not time for my farewell speech. But one of these days I'll retell the story of starting in a hotel after praying in homes, doing church in a school, being provided first with land and then building and then members, seeing God assemble a leadership team and a gifted and skilled family of believers who shared common experiences, a first Sunday of worship, shared covenants, empty pockets, incredible days of giving, nights of praise, visions and Christmas celebrations. How did 27 people become 2,000 people? All credit to God. But you see, once you've reviewed what God has done in the past, there is an obligation moving forward to restate your loyalty. Look at verse 14. Now, therefore, fear the Lord and serve Him in sincerity and truth, and do away with the gods which your fathers served beyond the Euphrates River and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. Given God's continuing faithfulness, the people's primary obligation was to declare their absolute loyalty to Him. Because of verses 1 through 13, therefore, he says, fear the Lord. That is, have reverence and awe toward God and His Word. Serve Him with faithfulness. That is a sincerity of faith that honors God in the way we live our lives. Throw away other gods. Displace any priority that would lay claim over God. Seek first the kingdom, and then let God add other things. And he said, serve the Lord with all of your resources, all of your life, all of your skills, all of your time, all of your energy, all of your wealth. The emphasis here is because God has given us everything we have, our remaining days to our final breath should be us giving everything we've received and expending that, including our life itself, in the service of the King. I want to appear before the throne all used up. Well, now here's the best part. Verse 15. Joshua says, but if it is disagreeable in your sight to serve the Lord, choose for yourselves today whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served, which are beyond the Euphrates River, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. You see, God outlines his case for the obedience of his people, for their loyalty. And now, because God has made his case, Joshua calls for their acceptance. Choose the things in your past, the gods that your fathers served on the other side of the Euphrates, or choose alternatives in your present, the gods of the Amorites in whose land you live right now. Or choose the future that God has set aside for you. Joshua declared his personal allegiance to God. He must have stirred that national assembly by his example. Here's the thing I see about that. Joshua is the greatest leader of his generation. I mean, he's in effect the ruler of Israel. And yet, did you notice what he did here? He didn't even pretend to make this decision for anybody else. He said, as for me and my house, the one thing that I am personally responsible for, we will serve the Lord. Now, here's why that's important. The devil has lied to us by telling us that we don't have influence, that we're not people of power. We don't roam the halls of the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. The history is made by other people. We just sort of have to get caught in the flow of it. Listen, I never wanted to be a congressman. I certainly didn't want to be president. But here's the lesson that we should find from Joshua. At the end of the day, we have exactly what Joshua had, which is the responsibility to lead well in our own sphere of influence. I pray for America. I pray for the church in America. But at the end of the day, there's only one thing that I can say with any confidence, and that is, whatever else happens, whatever decision anybody else might make, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And I'm telling you, a church filled with people who make that declaration, sold out faithfulness and obedience to Christ, that is a people who will be unmoved, never overwhelmed, and never defeated, no matter what the surrounding culture decides to do. Where is the extent of your sphere of influence? And have you declared in your own life and in the sphere you're responsible for that God will be number one? We are not yet perfect. Therefore, we need regular self-examination and intentional choosing of loyalty to God. That's what Joshua does here. The conquest is over for the most part. It's time for the people to look at themselves and say, moving forward, are we going to be faithful to the God that our fathers and grandfathers served? Because He is faithful, we must renew our dedication. Today is a day that we say, I'm in. I will serve the Lord. Verse 29, now it came about after these things that Joshua the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died, being 110 years old. And they buried him in the territory of his inheritance in Timnath-Serah, which is in the hill country of Ephraim, on the north of Mount Gash. Israel served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who survived Joshua and had known every deed of the Lord which He had done for Israel. Now they buried the bones of Joseph, which the sons of Israel had brought up from Egypt at Shechem, in the plot of land which Jacob had bought from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem, for 100 pieces of money. And they became the inheritance of Joseph's sons. And Eleazar, the son of Aaron, died, and they buried him at Gibeah, the town of his son Phinehas, which was given to him in the hill country of Ephraim. Why do we finish the story this way? These closing verses feel sort of like when you come to the end of the movie and then the screen goes black and then you get the printout of the end of the epilogue, you know, the way everything ended up. That's what these closing verses are. But here's what we're supposed to notice. You remember, Joseph is actually included in Hebrews chapter 11 as a man of great faith for an interesting thing. For all the great things that Joseph did in his life, the writer of Hebrews includes Joseph in the hall of faith because he refused to allow his bones to be buried in Egypt. He said, eventually, God's going to take you up out of here because He promised. And eventually, He's going to give you a promised land because of the promises He made to Abraham. And eventually, you're going to have all that God has promised you. Don't you bury my bones in the sand of Egypt. You take me with you. We're now 60 years removed from Egypt. And Joseph has been dead for 430 years before that. So we're 500 years from the death of Joseph. And Joseph's bones are finally buried in the land of promise. Joshua died. What did they do with him? They buried him in his portion of the inheritance of the promised land. Eleazar, the son of Aaron, the priest, he died. Where did they bury him? In the promised land. This story couldn't have ended any better. Because those who had lived by the promise have now become the people who saw the promise. But here's the thing. What the writer of Hebrews 11 tells us is that was just the promise for the land. The real promise that they were looking forward to all the way back to Abraham was the promise of the Messiah and the forgiveness of sins and the guarantee of a true homeland that surrounds the throne of God. Folks, we're not that different from the generation that followed Joshua. We are still meant to live our lives in faithfulness, obedience, and loyalty to God because we haven't seen home yet, but we have the promise. And come hell or high water, the promise is good. So our only response is, y'all do what you want. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. Father, thank you for these words. Thank you for the book of Joshua. Thank you for all that we see here, that we've been taught by your Spirit in these days. Thank you for the people who are a part of this church, who are so fascinated and faithful, who want to know your word. It is a blessing to me to be allowed to teach such a people. Lord, as we leave the book of Joshua, don't let us leave it completely, but draw us back to a book that has now captured our imagination. Let us find by your Spirit still more and more there than we've even been allowed to see this week. Make your word precious to us. Give us a hunger, a thirst to know it better, and by knowing your word better, to know our Savior better. Father, as your eyes roam to and fro across the earth, may a people called Evergreen be a place where you see that our hearts are completely yours. This is our prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.
You prepare a table for me in the presence of my foes. Where else would I go but you, Lord? What else would I do but praise? Jesus, you're my rock and refuge, shelter